Kia ora koutou, good morning. Thanks, Fran and Prime Minister, for an interesting session. It's my pleasure to facilitate this next session with the Minister of Trade for New Zealand, the Honourable Damien O'Connor, and Assistant Minister for Trade for Australia, the Honourable Tim Ayres. Shortly, I'm going to welcome Minister Damien O'Connor to the stage to make some remarks, and he will then introduce Minister Ayres, who will do likewise before we have a discussion for which I'm sure around China, the WTO, CPTPP, RCEP, DEPA, and a host of other acronyms. There'll be no shortage of things to chew over. On that basis, I'm not going to steal Minister O'Connor's thunder on Honourable Tim Ayres, but I do, Tim, want to give you a very warm welcome to New Zealand. We appreciate having you here. Our other most important economic relationship is the one we're talking about today. In terms of the Honourable Damien O'Connor, unlike some of his colleagues, including the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins, I don't feel I know you, Damien, incredibly well. What I can say, however, is today he's one of our most experienced parliamentarians, first elected in 1993, when Chippy and I were still at high school. Today, he's synonymous with our agricultural sectors, farming, and the West Coast. And when I think of him, I also think, Damien, of the parliamentary rugby team, which I think he co-captains with Mark Mitchell, MP. In terms of trade, my subjective opinion is that this last year or two has been one of the minister's finest career-wise, given the momentum and success we've had on a number of agreements that the Prime Minister's talked about. Minister Damien O'Connor, welcome to the China Business Summit 2023.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Simon. It's always really nice to use the term experienced rather than old. Tēnā koutou katoa, Daja hao. Firstly, to my mate, Australian mate, Tim Ayres, it's great to have you here. You're over for the Australia-New Zealand Leadership Forum, but also we had, of course, the weekend of CPTPP. Wonderful to have you here. Ambassador Wong, to my parliamentary colleague, Todd McClay, out there somewhere, to my parliamentary colleagues, Shannon Halbert and Nancy Chen, and to members of the Diplomatic Corps and all others, and of course to Fran and to Simon, thank you. But also to a whole lot of familiar faces out there that I have seen more recently, of course, as the Prime Minister said, on our trade mission. I hope they're familiar and friendly. I don't think I offended too many people. Actually, travelling with the Prime Minister, I said, it's pretty cool, really, because it kind of takes the pressure off me. And I feel a bit like Tonto, or as I said, sometimes Tonto's horse, because you're just in the background while the Prime Minister does all the hard graft. And I have to say that it was a big challenge, and he did really, really well in a very, very important market. Jerry Brownlee, I see you there. Sorry, I missed you. So great to have you here. Another one of the experienced politicians. Look, as Minister for Trade and Export Growth, it is my privilege to share with New Zealand's perspectives on the regional trade landscape and some of the opportunities and the challenges that we face. The theme of the trade panel is navigating a pathway through regional trade tensions. As you'll be aware, the global economy and the international rules-based system currently face major headwinds. There is increasing pressure on multilateralism, growing protectionism, and geostrategic pressures. Global economic growth is slowing, reflecting the impact of rising inflation and tighter monetary policy on household budgets and spillovers from Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Alongside this, climate change risks and impacts are affecting our economies, environments, and ways of life in all countries. So it's timely that we discuss not only the challenges, but also the opportunities and tools to help us navigate these complex times. Indeed, trade should be a positive force. With consistent rules trade, we can and should. It should be one of the solutions to the challenges that we all face globally. As a small export-orientated economy, it is hard to overstate the importance to New Zealand of a trading system underpinned by rules rather than might. Regional trade architecture ensures New Zealand has a seat at the table on an even footing with the big players, and we all have the same consistent rules of the road and ways of settling disputes when we disagree. It's only natural that competition should exist, and it is in everyone's interest that such competition is managed in a way that reduces friction and enables cooperation on issues of global concern. To begin, I'd like to first offer some observations regarding the trade and economic opportunities observed during our recent visit to China, led by Prime Minister Hipkins, as well as some remarks regarding the New Zealand-China trade relationship. As Prime Minister Hipkins has noted, the visit was an opportunity to support our reconnection and trade recovery strategies and help New Zealand businesses to refresh and renew connections with this very important market. We had one simple yet important message. New Zealand is open for business and pleasure, as our tourism sector welcomes increasing numbers of visitors. And I can assure you that we work tirelessly to advocate for New Zealand businesses, from opening doors to fostering new relationships, which in turn grow our New Zealand economy. The visit highlighted that our trade links, underpinned by our recently upgraded free trade agreement, have proven incredibly resilient during and post the COVID-19 pandemic. I note that since the signing of our free trade agreement in 2008, as the Prime Minister said, our two-way trade has boomed and now surpasses $40 billion per year. This is due in large part to the hard work of New Zealand businesses and the people in this room to realise the opportunity that the government creates through free trade agreements. We were pleased to connect with New Zealand businesses in China, showcase our world-class products and services in one of the world's largest consumer markets, and to welcome back, as was said, Chinese students, the tourists and business people. Air connectivity is steadily improving, as evidenced by our announcement of an additional air route between China and New Zealand. The extra capacity, of course, helping to further facilitate trade, tourism, and people-to-people connections. New Zealand, as was said, continues to be well regarded in China. However, maintaining access for New Zealand businesses requires a sustained long-term effort. Like any relationship, we continue to invest to improve our understanding of Chinese consumers and work with Chinese counterpart agencies and market to ensure that New Zealand meets their consumer preferences and evolving regulatory regimes. We also had the opportunity to hear from businesses on the ground about some of the opportunities and challenges that they're facing in market. It's a dynamic environment, and the New Zealand government is working hard to ensure our businesses are well supported to seize these opportunities. And I have to have a shout out for NZTE and the people who have worked offshore alongside MFAT to continue to keep our profile up in that market. It was also clear that in a market like China, the combination of government and business is highly effective. In this regard, I was pleased to meet my counterpart, Commerce Minister Wong Win-Tao, adding to our regular ministerial catch-ups around the globe. These engagements are key to ensuring that our strong trade ties are underpinned by open and constructive political relationships. Many of the commercial signings witnessed during the mission will contribute to boosting sales of New Zealand products and services in China, and together representing a combined forecast increase in annual sales to relevant New Zealand companies of more than $510 million. This is by 2026, and I'm sure, as most of our forecasts have been, severely undershoot what we actually achieve. The kiwifruit export plan agreed between MPI and China Customs now provides for stable biosecurity trade conditions for the export of kiwifruit into China, underpinning the $63 million trade that this iconic product has into that market. Amazing, really, when we kind of took the raw material, developed it, and then are sending it back. It's clear that China is an important market for us in all these areas and will continue to be so. However, our government does understand that our exporters need diverse options and opportunities when it comes to trade. In line with the government's trade recovery strategy, we are therefore continuing to promote diversification and resilience by pursuing new free trade agreements and modernising existing ones that benefit New Zealand and New Zealand businesses. Our government has successfully concluded and modernised a number of significant free trade agreements in recent years. RCEP, CPTPP, UK FTA, EU FTA, ANZFTA. If you don't know what these acronyms mean, you probably shouldn't be in this room or you haven't spoken to MFAT. Look, these are significant agreements and it's been wonderful to move those all forward. With some of these FTA building blocks in place, we are also focusing on existing free trade mechanisms to ensure that we're fully leveraging the benefits from our FTA network for all New Zealanders. This year we're chairing, as was said, the comprehensive and progressive CPTPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we hosted ministers here over the last couple of days, Tim being one of them. For many, it was their first time to New Zealand, and it was wonderful to host them and to show them a little slice of our wonderful country. They'll return home with a lot of enthusiasm. Our hosting year provides an opportunity to demonstrate leadership in areas of importance to our country by advancing the implementation and expansion of the agreement, highlighting the importance, as was said, of inclusive and sustainable trade, including Indigenous trade and economic empowerment, and ensuring that the agreement remains the gold standard for our region and delivers for all our people. The UK's accession to CPTPP and the growing number of economies that want to join CPTPP demonstrate the value and the appeal of the agreement. We continue to welcome applications from those economies that can meet the high standards of the agreement and other requirements as outlined by CPTPP ministers. Other regional architecture has opened up pathways across the region, such as the recently upgraded ASEAN Australia New Zealand, ANZFTA. This agreement now includes more modern trade facilitative rules, including streamlined customs procedures and stronger e-commerce rules. We're also working on evolving regional architecture. For example, New Zealand is actively participating in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, with the United States and 12 other countries. This is an important way to bring the United States into regional trade and economic architecture following its withdrawal from TPP. Negotiations on a first-of-its-kind supply chain agreement, one of the 4 distinct pillars of IPEF, were concluded while I was in Detroit in late May, and intensive work continues on the other 3 pillars. We're also looking ahead to how we can band together with other like-minded economies to tackle trade issues that have the potential to drive economic growth and innovation into our future. In this context, New Zealand has been proud to establish the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA, with Singapore and Chile. The DEPA aims to cover the breadth of the digital economy. It is designed to function as a pathfinder agreement that will help shape new norms in digital trade over time. As part of this vision, the DEPA is an open plurilateral agreement, meaning it is open to other WTO members who can meet the high quality requirements and standards. We're pleased to have recently concluded accession negotiations with Korea and have ongoing discussions with other economies interested in joining, including China. Looking out beyond the region, New Zealand is continuing to invest heavily with multilateral institutions such as the WTO and in norm-building institutions like APEC and OECD. Robust rules-based architecture remains the best way for New Zealand to maximise opportunities for our exporters across a whole range of markets, particularly in the face, as was said before, of protectionism, geopolitical tensions, and economic uncertainties. I shared last year with you the meaningful outcomes reached at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, particularly the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, something that New Zealand has been advocating for 20 years. And we're pleased to see that China formally accepted the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement at the end of June, and New Zealand hopes to do so shortly. Look, just a couple of weeks ago in Geneva, negotiations on the WTO Plurilateral Investment Facilitation for Development were substantially concluded. This agreement, including both New Zealand and China, aims to make investment rules more transparent and efficient for investors. Equally important, it shows that there is still momentum and commitment in the WTO to bring consensus around rules. In the same spirit, New Zealand continues to work in the WTO to address other long-standing issues like agriculture and the role of environmentally harmful subsidies. Ministers will again convene for the 13th Ministerial Conference in February next year. Look, I'd now like to conclude by introducing my good friend and mate Tim Ayres. Senator Tim Ayres is Assistant Minister for Trade, who, along with his colleague Don Farrell, do an outstanding job representing their country and working alongside us in a true Australasian and trans-Tasman effort to promote the rules of trade, promote fair trade, and it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'd just like to welcome you to the stage. Tim, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Damien. It's a real pleasure to be here. It is true that this forum does start early. And it's pretty early in Sydney right now, I can tell you. I really very much have appreciated the welcome that I and the other CPTPP ministers have had in Auckland over the last few days. It was a very good meeting, and New Zealand's chairing role of that in 2023 has been exemplary, and New Zealand's played a critical role actually in developing the sort of collective relationships in what is a very high quality plurilateral agreement that is important beyond its own economic dimensions, in my view, for the development of innovative trade arrangements in a global environment that sorely needs trade innovation. I want to acknowledge the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, enjoyed that speech very much. Damien, formally acknowledge you and other parliamentary colleagues from New Zealand, Your Excellency Wang Xiaolong, the Chinese ambassador, and other members of the diplomatic community. You know, I should say that in the year that I've had this role, there's a few trade ministers around the world who stick out, and Damien O'Connor is one of them. His role prosecuting the argument for New Zealand and New Zealand's interests, which sit very close to Australia's interests in terms of the issues that Damien just traversed: agriculture trade liberalisation, market access for our economies on a fair basis to the large economies of the world, sustainable trade, inclusive trade. Damien does play a leading role prosecuting those arguments and has developed relationships with trade ministers across the world. And I just wanted to say in front of this audience, mate, I really appreciate the support and occasional bits of sort of pragmatic guidance that you've given Don and I in the way that Damien, that only Damien can really give you that sort of pragmatic nudge from time to time. Mate, we really appreciate it. Of course, this weekend and this week is an opportunity for me to be here and represent the Australian government, not just at the CPTPP and at this event today, but also, of course, it's the 40th anniversary of the Closer Economic Relations Agreement. You know, it is the relationship between Australia and New Zealand, of course, goes well beyond our economic relationship. Of course it does. Historically, culturally, founded over the decades and centuries. But the closer economic relationship is the closest of economic relationships, and it's 40 years old, and it is worth celebrating. And we'll be doing that. In Wellington over the course of tomorrow and the day after. The thing about truisms, of course, is that they're true. And people say them over and over again, and they lose force, of course, through repetition. But the world and the region that we share, particularly the trading environment, has become more complex. COVID has impacted inflation and supply chains. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine threatens established rules and norms and has an impact, of course, well beyond Europe. Geostrategic competition is increasing, including and particularly in our region of the world. And the existential generational task of decarbonisation is more and more pressing. In the face of these challenges, the question is, how can countries like Australia and New Zealand adapt to our changing circumstances? Australia's Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has said that Australia's interests, she said, lie in a region that operates by rules, standards and norms, where a larger country does not determine the fate of a smaller country, where each country can pursue its own aspirations, its own prosperity. Australia, like New Zealand, and like so many other countries, depends on a world underpinned by agreed rules and norms. This is very much true for our approach to trade. Our Trade Minister, Don Farrell, summed up Australia's approach to trade as this. He said, "We are committed to free, fair and open trade where the rules of the game are known and respected." These are principles that we continue to believe in, even after several years of severe disruption in the global trading environment. But this requires negotiation and persistence and dialogue. And it requires respect for the rules-based multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organisation at its core. A key part of the government's role in this context is to maintain stable and productive relationships that enable international trade that is sustainable and inclusive. Negotiation and dialogue take time, but they yield better and more sustainable results. Throughout all this, our message to business in Australia is clear. Diversification will continue to be critical. Diversification, of course, in terms of market access to economies around the world and ensuring that businesses and the economy don't have our eggs in just one basket, but also in terms of product diversity, diversifying Australia's product and services offering to the world through clear and purposeful industry policy to reindustrialise the Australian economy. That's why the Australian government is committed to its trade diversification agenda. Australian barley producers have demonstrated that diversification translates into resilience. Since 2020, China's 80.5% duties on Australian barley have effectively blocked exports to that market. Our barley exporters pivoted and successfully expanded to markets like Saudi Arabia, Japan and Kuwait. However, despite these trade impediments, China remains our largest trading partner and will remain so for the foreseeable future. So through advocacy and dialogue, we're continuing to work to get Australian products back into Chinese homes. Engagements the Prime Minister and other ministers have had with their Chinese counterparts have helped steer the Australia-China bilateral relationship towards a more stable and constructive path. We look forward to and will continue to strongly advocate for the resumption of normal trade across the board. And indeed, in the face of these challenges, it's more important than ever that the WTO is functioning effectively and resiliently. Australia is committed to reinforcing the rules-based multilateral trading system by reforming and strengthening the World Trade Organisation. We are working hard with colleagues like Damien and New Zealand to achieve a fully functioning dispute resolution system as quickly as possible. We're also leading new rulemaking efforts, such as on e-commerce and driving discussions on global challenges like climate change to ensure that the World Trade Organisation can underpin prosperity into the future. Countries like Australia and New Zealand need to make sure that we have not just a seat at the table, but a leading voice, and a leading voice together on these questions. Because smaller and middle economies like ours have the most to lose from diminished international institutions. I'm very conscious that a group like this, as attentive as you have been, are working your way through at this early stage of the day, your third in a row speech from a politician. You know, us Australians, we're sensitive kind of characters with a lot of emotional intelligence. So what I'd propose to do is to leave my speech there at this stage and welcome questions from the audience. Thank you, Damien, and thank you, Simon.
Hey, well, thanks so much, Minister. Yeah, I know both of you were given clear instructions on time. Neither of you followed it, but there you go. What is good is it's good to see the bromance between you two there, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're both fresh off a CPTPP ministerial. How was it?
Oh, brilliant.
Expand?
Look, it was a wonderful gathering. And I guess celebration. It's been hard work to bring the UK in. Japan chaired a session working group. It was hard work, and there were a lot of lessons learned in that process. But to finally get them over the line, I think, and expand, it was the first non-member to come in. And I guess to reinforce the values, the objectives, and the standards of CPTPP. And I want to thank those people in the room here who were part of the original P4 TPP and then CPTPP. It's a valuable piece of trade architecture.
Turns out I don't need to turn it on; it is on. Apart from, of course, well, I mean, on bromances, it was expertly chaired, I have to say. I was really struck by a couple of things, Simon. One, that this agreement now with the UK's accession, 500 million people covered by the agreement, around 15% of the world's GDP, $12 trillion worth of economic activity covered by the agreement. That's the first observation. The scale of it now, and Damien's talked about the high quality, the high standards of the agreement. But it's also an environment, I think, where you can have high quality discussions about the kind of innovations that we need in trade and trade arrangements. I was delighted to announce that Australia will join the Inclusive Trade Action Group, which actually is an opportunity to make sure, not only from a sort of substantial social justice perspective, that trade speaks to the broadest possible constituency and involves as many of our citizens in the opportunities of trade, but also assists to establish the social licence and the social legitimacy and the democratic legitimacy of our trading arrangements. But also it's good economics, right? The more people who are engaged in trade, the more workers who work for firms that are engaged in trade. The higher our wages are, the higher our labour productivity is, the higher the level of business investment. So Australia really coming to the table on that agenda over the course of this weekend was something that I really welcomed.
Thank you. It's a gold standard, to use your words, plurilateral agreements. I see real risks, though. I mean, one of them is you've got a bunch of countries now, or economies, that want accession. There's a danger here, isn't there, that this just becomes much ado about nothing for a long time because of, frankly, the geopolitics. Or on the other side of it, actually, the quality is lowered as it's reopened, maybe by parties that are already in it. Tell us how you see it going and the time frame you see it happening in.
Look, there was much discussion around the reality of the changing world and the fact that we need to review and upgrade that agreement, even though by international standards it's not old, but the world's moving really, really quickly. And it's a consensus-based agreement. And one of the things that we did, working off what Tim said around digital economy, and the opportunities and some of the barriers that still exist around the use of digitisation and the movement of goods and services. We've got to look at that and make sure that CPTPP, if it is to remain gold standard, that we upgrade parts of that agreement to be at the forefront. So the idea of then expanding that agreement and bringing people into an agreement that might be older or in areas redundant is not something that we want to oversee. So we've committed, I think, in a consensus way, to actually undertake a review and upgrade what is necessary. Tim?
I think it's an improbable agreement, really, the CPTPP. If you think about its history, it's with the United States pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The likelihood that the 12 countries that were sitting around the table this weekend in Auckland would, over the span of that decade or so, been able to establish such a high-quality agreement, it is unlikely, and it reflects a lot of hard work and determination and a particular spirit of cooperation that has been brought to that agreement. That's why it's a high-quality, high-standard agreement. And it's not a wonder then that, well, yes, there are, I think, 6 formal applications for accession, but many other economies sitting behind that who are, engaging with the CPTPP and with individual parties to the CPTPP, anxious to engage with the opportunities that agreement represents. But I guess our attitude is to focus on the quality of the agreement, but secondly, to take our time. We have taken a long time to secure an agreement of this quality. Australia's view, and I think the view of the other CPTPP parties, is there is no rush.
The dragon in the room, China. I think I know both of your positions. I've heard from the Prime Minister, keep the quality up, consensus building, welcome all. If you've got anything to add to that, Damien, and for you, Tim, I've seen pretty well publicised comments from you, but give us your view or your country's view on China and accession to CPTPP.
Look, I've had a number of discussions with Minister Wong Wentao on this, and clearly China is one of the 6 aspirant economies. Really important that bilateral discussions occur so that all the members are confident that China and any other aspirant economy, and Ukraine has indicated an enthusiasm to maybe join up, so it's not just about the Pacific, it is now European as well. But the point is that the standards that we have we've negotiated hard for must be maintained. There's a point that the track record of maintaining such standards has to be proven, and that there has to be a reassurance on a bilateral basis with all the members of CPTPP that any member that comes in can meet them and continue to uphold them. And so when that bilateral reassurance can be offered, then I think that's at the point that collectively we discuss the process of accession for any one of those applicants.
Yeah, I'd just say, Simon, I mean, in my public comments and in my view, that of course Australia's prosecuted over the course of this weekend, I don't reflect on any individual accession application. Just make the point in the broad that, first of all, there are the 6 applicants. Secondly, that sitting behind that is a range of other potential accession applications that the CPTPP parties... Gosh, it's a mouthful, isn't it?
Damien shouldn't have added the CP.
Well,
there was just no need.
I think we can blame the Canadians. One of the innovations in this agreement is we might over the course of the year or next year, things move slowly in these agreements. So it might be the VCPP, TPP, the very comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Firstly, there's the applicants. Secondly, there's a cluster of other countries countries and economies that we ought to consider. Thirdly, this task of reviewing, it sounds like a sort of, it sounds a bit sort of Brussels or Geneva, doesn't it? A sort of review of the articles of the agreement actually really matters. When this agreement was being developed, 3G didn't exist, let alone 4G or 5G, let alone artificial intelligence. People were ringing each other up on the old Nokia to negotiate the provisions of this agreement. The world comes at you pretty fast. Climate and energy, the requirement in our region, the investment gap, if this region, the fastest growing region of the world in human history, is going to meet the climate objectives and have low cost, low emissions, reliable energy for a region that needs it, not just as it does the transition to a net zero economy, but as a transition to development and bigger middle classes and higher industrialisation. The agreement is going to have to lead on these questions, and that is going to require a lot of work. And of course, we want to make sure that the agreement not only maintains the high standards, so applicants need to meet those high standards and have a demonstrated track record. And of course, then, as Damien said, it requires consensus. These are all difficult tests to meet, and we're going to take our time to work out how we logically and sensibly approach those challenges over the course of the coming years.
We've spent too much time on CPTPP, but Louis on the Slido had a good question around the states and its attitude to it. I mean, let me answer that. It's not interested, is it? What do we do to keep the United States in the frame on trade?
Look, I think they've said to us quite clearly they're not interested at this stage of coming back, but there's reference to it. IPEF is a structure. It's not a formal trade structure, but it's a pathway for the US to re-engage in the Indo-Pacific region. They have been absent for too long. We need a dynamic, realistic, diverse range of players down here, and so we'll continue to work as we can through IPEF. And then see what evolves from that. I think, trade's a challenging area, not only for the US, and in fact, to go back to CPTPP, inclusiveness is something that was seen as a bit social and unnecessary in trade agreements. It is absolutely essential now, just as sustainability and decarbonisation is, because the social licence to promote trade in countries like Malaysia depend upon bringing on board people who feel disconnected. And for us, it's trade for all. Other countries have a different title for it, but that inclusive nature is essential. The US has to reach out and ensure that many of its stakeholders see the value in building trade and coming back into things like CPTPP.
Well, I suppose IPEF's the vehicle for the United States. It's also a big agreement. It, of course, is not a market access agreement, but in itself it has, I think, some potential for innovation. The supply chains pillar that was agreed in Detroit a few weeks ago, I think is world leading in terms of its innovation. It of course, from Australia's perspective, we would have preferred the United States had not withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. No use crying over spilt milk. My view is that we should continue to engage. You know, I think I was saying to a colleague earlier, everything stays the same until it doesn't, and we'll watch that space very closely. I agree with Damien's point. You know, we've had decade after decade where the certainties prosecuted by proponents of free trade, which I support, were asserted in a way that didn't have a focus on inclusion and sustainability. And that, I think, in the United States has, you know, made trade a difficult political subject in their political system. And we've got to attend to that in our own communities and make sure that we're prosecuting the argument for trade in a way where people understand it's about good jobs, it's about better paid jobs, it's about business investment, it's about creating opportunities for everybody across the society, and we've got to make that real for people.
Let's talk China. Damien, you've just been there. We've got an upgraded FTA. The economy's not as buoyant, actually, in either economies as we'd probably like them. How do we keep getting growth? Where's that come from, assuming that we still want it? And for you, Tim, I mean, we know your government's seeking to stabilise relations. You've mentioned candidly the barley tariff and other things there. I mean, how do you navigate all of that and the geotensions that are undoubtedly there?
I might, maybe I'll go first. I think the first point is that Australia will calmly and consistently advocate our position, asserting the principles that I went through, of course, in the speech that I just gave. Calmly and consistently advocate our interest, cooperate where we can and disagree where we must in a way that you know, is, as our Prime Minister said at the Shangri-La dialogue a few weeks ago, where there is a premium on dialogue, you know, advocating our position. Now, of course, there are a series of trade impediments in the Chinese system at the moment to trade from some categories of Australian exports. You know, the best time for those trade impediments to be removed, of course, was yesterday. We are, however, working our way through those in a careful and systematic way, advocating the Australian interest, and we've made some progress, but there is still quite some progress to go, and we're going to continue working through that in a careful and systematic way.
I mean, I think the opportunities are exciting and unlimited. Expanding beyond logs and dairy and other areas of gaming, and the recent trade mission, I guess, highlighted a couple of things. Is that we need to know more about what we are doing within our country offshore. That is, sometimes it's only on trade missions that people realise that there's another business in a completely different sector, you know, taking on the same challenges in the same market, and that collaboration, I think, is invaluable. You know, post-COVID, China growth is only at 5% in a market of 1.4 billion people. I would suggest that there are plenty of opportunities for smart, innovative, energetic New Zealand exporters and importers as well. You know, I see no limit on the opportunities, but people, exporters and importers, have to make decisions about where they want to move to, what diversity they want in their own portfolio. And as I've said before, as a small business owner, you know, that relied on Kiwi experience buses to turn up, you know, that provided over 50% of our turnover, we were exposed. And I think that reality applies whether you're a big or small business.
Look, there's so much more we could touch on. I see a number of questions, though, on climate and sustainability. We should certainly talk about that. Mitigating climate risks, promoting climate-positive trade. There aren't real international rules, the question asks, on sustainability. Talk to us about that, how we get climate and sustainability into trade in a meaningful way.
Well, maybe there's two areas I would focus on. Number one, the set of issues that I outlined before. The investment, the financing gap between where the world needs to get to and where a region needs to get to in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation, but also in new energy infrastructure, is vast, and we need to make sure that global trade rules and the direction of travel for governments and the private sector in that area is in the right direction. And that is an enormous task. Number two issue, but just as important for both of our economies, is making sure that the sustainability agenda, particularly in agriculture, is well understood by businesses here, but also that we are very clear in some of the markets overseas about what real sustainability actually means in agricultural terms. We have very different agricultural production systems in Australia and New Zealand, and there is a bit of, I think, particularly in the European context, but also in the United States, I think a bit of talking past each other in terms of what sustainability means. For Australian and New Zealand farmers, sustainability means producing more with less. You know, it means higher levels of efficiency, and that's why our approach in the WTO and with our friends in Europe and other economies more broadly is about trade liberalisation in agriculture, about reducing harmful subsidies that are actually bad for the environment, bad for efficiency, bad for food security. That's the Australia and New Zealand, that's the Cairns Group agenda in agriculture trade liberalisation. We need to make sure we're prosecuting that argument and make sure that we're deepening, I think, understanding between our agricultural systems here and agricultural production systems overseas, so people understand that we bring a lot, both of our economies bring a lot to the table in terms of sustainability in agriculture.
Look, thanks, and I think whether it's green or sustainability or decarbonisation, these are locked into every discussion internationally at the moment. And it's not just good enough to be at the leading edge. We were in Sweden the other day meeting with Scania and Volvo, arguably the most efficient trucks in the world. They have got huge money going into R&D to further improve. So it's not good enough to be the best. You've got to be better. And we all have to try and reduce the impact on the climate and on our emissions. And we in agriculture, and like Australia, you know, we're pretty efficient. You might say we're the best in the world. That's no excuse for not trying harder. And I think as long as we're doing our bit in whatever sector we operate, then we will get the respect and the opportunities into markets. But the minute we're seen to be ignoring the reality of climate change, then we will start to see growing resistance and barriers to trade. And so, again, through collaboration, through cooperation, we can, particularly with Australia, but reaching out into China, into Europe, the collaboration through the Global Research Alliance that we have in agriculture or other areas of decarbonisation, of sustainability, better biodiversity. These are the realities that we are facing internationally.
Well, may the bromance continue, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to Tim Ayres and Damien O'Connor.